Hello, and welcome to Varm Vlog's Radical Engagement. And today we're talking about A Unity of Opposites, The Dengist and the Red Guard by Douglas A. Greene, who's been on the show a couple of times. Because of the success of Midwestern Marx, Losurdo's book on Western Marxism seems to have been penetrating a lot of people's consciousness. It's a book that I agree with the critique of David Broder from 2017 about. It has severe limitations, but many of the facts and stuff that it talks about in regards to what goes on in Vietnam and China is good if selective. Now, I have less fond things to say about Garrido's book on the same topic, and I did a almost 24-hour discussion of it on Patreon, and I'm not releasing to the public, but nonetheless. And I think dealing with some of the implications of this worldview is interesting and what may have been motivating it. So I'm going to turn to Doug Greene here. Unity of Opposites, The Dengist and the Red Guard, published in 2022 by Doug Greene from MR Online. According to Mao Zedong, the principal law of materialist dialectics is the unity of opposites, which I've never quite thought was actually the principal law of materialist dialectics. But we'll get back to that. I understand who Mao was talking to and who his audience was and why he does kind of simplify it that way, but that's not really what Hegel or Marx was really on about. The unity of opposites is not. It is not a static thing where the opposite is unified with the same. Thus, it is quite fitting to observe that we can find the unity of opposites on display in the evaluations of Mao himself, as presented by Domenico Losurdo and Alain Badiou. As I pointed out in my discussion of Guido, see Patreon, that a lot of that discussion about what was going on in China attributes things to Western Marxists that were actually internal debates within Chinese communism itself, and that Guido is selectively only presenting one side of it or only knows one side of it. But anyway, we're back to Losurdo. For Losurdo, Mao is praised for his realism, nationalism, and attention to economic modernization. By contrast, Alain Badiou sees Mao as an eternal rebel, a symbol of the communist idea, and a universalist. These positions could not be more opposed. No, they can't. Even in their judgment about what Mao did wrong in the Cultural Revolution, both provide different answers. On one hand, Losurdo condemns Mao for going too far with mass rebellion, while on the other, Badiou faults Mao for not going far enough. I've always found Badiou's love of the collectivist period, but also his love of just the pure rebellion and bloodshed of the Cultural Revolution to be kind of strange. Yet, as we shall see, even though Losurdo and Badiou form a yin and yang, they both end up short when it comes to Mao. Domenico Losurdo. The late Losurdo, 1941 to 1918, was one of the foremost Marxist writers of his generation. He was an author of acclaimed studies on liberalism, which I like, Gramsci, which I haven't read, Hegel, or George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Marx. I think the Nietzsche book is like 80% good. Have problems with 20% of it, and I think the Hegel book on the philosophy of right is kind of strange. Losurdo was not simply an academic, but a militant in the Italian Maoist movement in the 1960s. When it came to Marxist-Leninism, Losurdo was forthright in his allegiance. This is a tradition which I recognize myself. By the 1980s, Losurdo had joined the Italian Communist Party. After dissolution in 1991, he was a member of the Communist Refoundation Party, founded by the Party of Italian Communists. The last organization that Losurdo joined was the Anti-Revisionist Communist Party of Italy, the PCI. At the 6th Congress of the PCI in 2011, Losurdo wrote, quote, "It is the coexistence of promising prospects and terrible threats that makes the construction and threatening of the Communist Party urgent. I sincerely hope that the party we are rebuilding today will be up to the task." Well, it hasn't been so far, but we'll see. In order to situate Losurdo's view of Mao, we need to grasp how he understood the different camps of Western and Eastern Marxism. According to Losurdo, Western Marxism was born as a reaction against imperialism, the slaughter of the First World War, and the aura of the Bolshevik Revolution. Quote, in the West, a radical, indeed apocalyptic historical turning point is undoubtedly represented by the outbreak and flare-up of the First World War. The tiredness, the disgust, the indignation at the interminable carnage, all this promotes a rapid spread of communist movements. Furthermore, he argues that Western Marxism was shaped not only by material circumstances, but also by the cultural tradition of Judeo-Christian Messianism. Early Western Marxists like Ernst Bloch, George Lukács, and Walter Benjamin all viewed the Russian Revolution through an apocalyptic lens as a utopian and universalist event that would deliver humanity from all vices of bourgeois society. In the ranks of Bolshevism, Losurdo singles out Leon Trotsky as an embodiment of this messianic spin of Western Marxism. If one could ever speak in Russian of Western Marxism, it was represented by Trotsky, which of course is a very simple view, but one that a vulgar Marxist-Leninist would take. However, Western Marxists were bound up to be disappointed once their hopes of achieving a class society did not come to pass in the USSR. Losurdo argues that Western Marxism could not comprehend the mundane need to develop reproductive forces and reckon with the so-called realism. Well, except that Western Marxists did actually realize that. That's why they didn't think it was possible to do in one country without opening yourself up to being subjected to the capitalist market, which China and the USSR did in different ways. The USSR did it in terms of loans, and the China did it in terms of its own trade capacity, which was the better way to go. Anyway, that's my own commentary. Let's go back to Doug's. Since figures like Trotsky refused to deal with this reality, they condemned efforts to do so by realists like Stalin as betrayals of the revolution. Any political program which fell short of demanding a social order without a state and a military apparatus seemed to be wholly inadequate. That's not what Trotsky said. Losurdo claims that since Western Marxism are detached from the material realities of imperialist encirclement and economic backwardness, they made a virtue of poverty and authenticity that was akin to a religious belief. Quote, in the eyes of these communists, the imperialist encirclement of real existing of socialism and the socialist revolution are simply as irrelevant as the Roman siege of Jerusalem and the Jewish national revolution was for the assembly of early Jewish Christians. From this perspective, every effort to analyze the concrete historical conditions is a distraction and immoral. The only thing that really matters is the authenticity and purity of the gospel of salvation. Now, if this reminds you of right-wing rhetoric like James Lindsay or Kurt von Kuhnlinen or Eric Vogelin, it's because it's very similarly structured. This idea of political theology being the reason why Western Marxism failed has more purchase on the right, but some Marxist-Leninists have picked it up to justify, frankly, the fact that their state doesn't exist anymore. And that there was a problem with the way, quote, Western Marxists viewed them. That some of these people then shift towards more right-wing views should surprise fucking no one. Anyway. In turn, this leads Western Marxists to disavow the experience of actually existing socialism as inauthentic. Losurdo argues that this position plays into the anti-communist prejudice. It kind of does. I'm not going to lie about that. It makes Western Marxism acceptable to the bourgeoisie. Quote, they passionately deny the accusation that they are in any way connected to the history of real existing socialism. At the same time, they reduce the history to simply serve as a horrors and hope that it will lend them credibility, especially in the eyes of the liberal bourgeoisie. Now, of course, anyone who knows the structure of arguments means that attributing motive to your opponents that you can't cite is a bad faith argument. It's literally trying to read someone else's mind. But nonetheless, it's a long tradition on the Marxist left to do such bullshit. So we have to take that with a grain of salt. Instead of taking this approach, Losurdo argues that socialism must purge itself from abstract utopianism, messianism, and internationalism that are the hallmarks of Western Marxism. We call this class collaboration, and historically Marx considered that treason to the cause. In its place, he advocates the embrace of realism, which includes normalizing the market, nationalism, the bureaucracy, the rule of law, and the promotion of material incentives. According to Losurdo, 20th century socialism failed because it was too permeated with Western Marxist abstractions. As a result, it was unable to connect with its material environment. Is that because Khrushchev, even though that doesn't make sense, Khrushchev wasn't remotely a Trotskyist? What's your reasoning here? I guess I have to read the book. What has been defeated in the third world and in the socialist camp itself is a Western Marxism that, having failed to take into account the national and religious identity, religion is often the essential constituent element of national identity of the countries in which it operated, has failed to orientalize itself, so to speak. This is opening itself up to the Confucianism was necessary for Mao thought that you often see taken by many Chinese nationalist communists today. Which is totally incongruent with Mao's own thought, but that's neither here nor there. I mean, the Cultural Revolution makes no sense if you believe that. Why fight against the five olds or the four olds? Right. By contrast, Losurdo says Marxist counterpart in Asia had a much different concerns than Western Marxism. In contrast, it was the reality of colonialism that provided the immediate environment that shaped the reception of Marxism after 1917. I think that's true. And as Losurdo says, what spoke the loudest to Marxists such as Mao was Lenin's theory of imperialism. Marxist-Leninism is the truth finally found on a long search, the ideological weapon capable of putting an end to the situation of oppression and contempt, opposed by colonialism and imperialism, the ideological weapon which ensures the victory of revolution in China. It's a nationalist project, essentially. While Western Marxists were cosmopolitan, separated from reality, Marx, like Mao, both understood and integrated the national life. Losurdo praises Mao's effort to nationalize Marxism, arguing that the sonification of Marxism was a unification of East and West, of general characteristics and national particularities. And if you know Losurdo's use of Hegel, this would not surprise you. Like the tension between universal and particular is something that Losurdo makes a lot out of as part of his defense of Stalin. In other words, Mao, along with Fidel Castro and Ho Chi Minh, fused together internationalism with patriotism. They never contradicted patriotism and internationalism. Indeed, they always saw it in light of the struggle for liberation of the oppressed nations as an essential movement in the march of internationalism and of universalism, of what Gramsci defined as the integral humanism. He notes that Western Marxism, with its pure vision of the universal, could only view these national liberation struggles with utter contempt. Except they didn't, though. Anyway, we'll come back here in a minute. In addition, Mao's thoughts on the productive forces were markedly different from those found in Western Marxism. Losurdo observes that the Long March and the anti-Japanese resistance were an epic endeavor. During the war, the Japanese targeted the whole population for subjugation, which meant that the class struggle and national resistance tended to merge in China. To fight Japan, the Communist Party of China, CPC, sought to build a unified front that included not only workers and peasants, but also the national bourgeoisie. In this fight for national survival, the CPC's commitment to production became inseparable from the greater war effort, which it was a developing country, it would have to. From this moment, at the beginning of the anti-Japanese war, the commitment to the production and development of the economy becomes, especially in liberated areas controlled by the Communist Party, at the same time an integral part of the national class struggle. It is clear then why, even in the midst of the war effort, Mao called communist leaders to pay close attention to the economic dimension of the conflict. Unlike Western Marxists, with their grand disdain for vulgar productive forces, Marxists in Asia saw the economic front as more important than the class struggle and national liberation. Which doesn't make sense with two worlds theory, or the greater contradiction theory, etc., 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 but we're not going to go into that right now. There are some people who can make that work, but it's not worked as stated here. According to Losurdo, the focus on an increase in production does not change after the foundation of the People's Republic in China in 1949. For one, China endured embargoes and economic attacks from the United States, which made no secret of its effort to overthrow the new regime. China might have secured national unity, but it faced the continued threat of imperialist aggression and neocolonial subjugation. Therefore, China's economic development had the twin task of social transformation and modernization. Recognizing the problems of the Soviet Union, but still wanting to continue the revolution, Mao turned to a Western Marxist solution. That's funny. I don't believe that for a second. As Losurdo observes, quote, Mao Zedong believed that these problems could be solved by the uninterrupted mobilization of the masses. This led to the Great Leap Forward, followed by the Cultural Revolution. And we're not going to talk about the 100 Flowers campaign, or the 10 to 15 years between the Great Leap Forward and the collective period of the Cultural Revolution. We're just going to sum that up in a fucking sentence? My God. People take this seriously? A new stage of the revolution was called upon to guarantee both the economic development and the progress and direction of socialism. This new stage of socialism has the mission of liberating the incentives of the masses from the all bureaucratic obstacles, even from the bureaucratic obstacles of the Communist Party and the state in which it's controlled. In other words, Losurdo since is in Mao the same Western Marxist abstract universalism in the figures such as Trotsky. Losurdo believed that both the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution created unrealistic millenarian moods and to mobilize people. Oh man, I should have Dong Han read Losurdo and see what Dong Han thinks about these assertions. He'll even defend the Great Leap Forward, which I kind of won't. In these campaigns, Mao undermined the authority of both the party and the state. Since these two institutions could no longer ensure stability, this meant that China was only held together by the prestige and power of Mao's personality, buttressed by the army. Because the mediating roles of the party and the state had been swept away, there really only existed, on one hand, the immediate relationship to charismatic leader, and on the other hand, the immediate relationship to the masses. Although they were in fact manipulated and fanaticized by means of the news media and controlled by the army, prepared to intervene in emergencies. These were truly the years of triumphal Bonapartism. I actually think Losurdo's stuff on Bonapartism may be interesting. He's got a book that was recently translated in English that I want to check out. For those of you who think I hate Losurdo, I don't. But I think the problems in Losurdo can lead to more and more class collaborationist views of what's going on until communism doesn't really mean anything. That's not just defending actually existing socialism, it's also denying that actually existing socialists had some of the same issues that Losurdo's critiquing in the West. By placing it as a Western problem because of the religious assumptions of Christianity and the political theology undergirding it, Losurdo is actually not dealing with the fact that this emerges in contradictions in, quote, Eastern Marxism itself as well. And if you've ever dealt with any group of Maoists today, dealing the different tendencies of Maoism, MIM and LM, Mao Zedong thought, socialism and Chinese characteristics, etc., which exist both in the Western context but also in China itself in different periods, you can see the problem of oversimplifying it like this. Anyway. For Losurdo, Mao's fundamental stake was relying on mass mobilization and revolutionary utopias. This was completely at odds with the requirements of, quote, realism. I put the quote there. The Great Leap Forward in the Cultural Revolution took no account of the need to normalize the process of transformation. No one can call upon the masses to be heroes all the time and to endure being and continuously and eternally mobilized, always ready to sacrifice, to do without, to deny oneself. The call to heroism must always remain an exception and never become the rule. I actually think Losurdo, while he's drawing some pretty overly black conclusions about this, is right here. The constant pushes here lead to social exhaustion. And I think that's true. I just don't like where Losurdo takes it in this text. Despite Mao's desire to increase productive forces and overcome inequity, Losurdo concludes that his efforts were unsustainable in the long term. After Mao's death, they were unsustainable in the long term. That's objectively true. After Mao's death, the leadership of the China passed to Deng Xiaoping. No, it didn't. There's an intermediary leader that everyone forgets about between 1978 and 1982. But okay, we'll get to there. Deng Xiaoping does seize control in 1982. It is not with the liquidation of the Gang of Four that Deng Xiaoping becomes the leader. There is the center, which was actually kind of known as the Nothingist Party in China, which no one ever fucking talks about, which was Mao's chosen successor as the intermediary between the Deng Xiaoping faction, or we might think is the semi-Bukharinist Stalinist faction, which is a weird thing in and of itself, and the, what we might say is left Marxist-Leninism of the Gang of Four. Anyway, oversimplifications abound, but since most people don't know Chinese history, you can get away with it. And there's lots of good, like I have read sections of this book that were good. I haven't read all the whole book though. I've kind of thumbed through it. A noted realist in the CPC, he was not interested in ideological purity, but increasing production through any means. Although he did so at the cost of the increasing standard of living of a lot of the rural countryside in the CPC, which was only mitigated by Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping. Which is why Xi Jinping is so sincerely popular in China. All right. As Deng famously said in 1962, it does not matter if a cat is a yellow cat or a black cat as long as it catches mice. Under Deng, the Cultural Revolution formally ended and the politics were normalized. Market socialism was introduced, leading to rapid increase of productive forces, along with inequity. China, for a little while, in the 1990s and early aughts, had a higher Gini coefficient than the United States, meaning there was more inequity there. Corruption and the degradation of social solidarity, although social solidarity is still way stronger in China than it is in the United States or Europe. I want to make that very fucking clear. But that's because of the collective period and because of the Cultural Revolution, for good and ill. Right. Losurdo believes China's return to the realism of Eastern Marxism is something to be celebrated. He argues that Deng's policies were successful in advancing the cause of socialism. Was it really successful to not educate rural girls, for example? Anyway, quote, and even in the attendant high cost, the outcomes of undertaking this new course is generally visible. A rapid expansion and development of productive forces, an economic miracle of European proportions, absolutely true, by the way. Access like never before to economic and social opportunities for hundreds of millions of Chinese, as long as they're in cities, but still absolutely true. All this adds up to the liberation process of enormous proportions. Correct. But that's almost an argument for capitalism, isn't it? It is safe to assume that Losurdo believes Deng's governance proves the superiority of Chinese Marxism over Western Marxism, with a focus on organizing the mechanisms of normacy, not utopian dreams. Yet, this does not mean Losurdo completely repudiates Mao's legacy. Deng changed the course by rejecting Mao's radicalism, but without repeating Nikita Khrushchev's approach to Joseph Stalin, demonizing those who preceded him in holding power. Deng himself bluntly acknowledged this. We do not do to Chairman Mao what Khrushchev did to Stalin. He knew that Mao was a source of legitimacy in China, which cannot be dismissed in one blow without irrevocably harming the CPC. Quote, Comrade Mao was not an isolated individual. He was a leader of our party until the moment of his death. When we write about his mistakes, we should not exaggerate, for otherwise we should be discrediting Chairman Mao Zedong, and that would mean discrediting our party and the state. Which I find interesting that they will admit this in terms of Mao, but when you get these same people talking about Stalin, they'll pretend like Stalin never made a mistake, which even Mao thought he did. Mao is quoted as saying Stalin didn't broke enough criticism. That was part of why he let the Thousand Flowers campaign happen, something, again, not even mentioned here. Right. This led to China to adopt the formal verdict of Mao being 70% good and 30% bad. I love meaningless percentages like this. Ironically, this was the same verdict Mao had on Stalin. Yeah, it was, by the way. In 1981, and I think people miss that, including people who are Maoist anti-revisionists today, the CPC approved the resolution on Mao's historical role. Ultimately, Mao was praised for his correct vision of Marxism before 1956, but afterwards, he pursued the incorrect Western Marxist policy of the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. Quote, chiefly responsibility for the grave left era of the Cultural Revolution was an error comprehensive in the magnitude and protracted in its duration, which does indeed lie with Comrade Mao Zedong, but after it was an era of a great proletarian revolutionary. For Losurdo, Deng in the CPT's defense of the realist approach to the utopian side of Mao, successfully preferred the validity of socialism in China and allowed for its continued advance. Quote, the procedure chosen by the new Chinese leadership in any case avoided the delegitimization of revolutionary power. It did. Above all, it made possible a genuine debate amongst conditions and characteristics of the construction of a social society. That's different. Deng was the first person to formally curtail free speech. Mao didn't even do that. Now, yes, there was consequences for your speech in the Cultural Revolution in China, but you did technically have it. All right. Because it did not shift all the difficult, uncertain, and objective contradictions onto one person as a scapegoat. And I actually will agree with Losurdo here to an extent, even though I don't like his book on Stalin, that making Stalin a scapegoat for the problems of the USSR is to avoid the harder issues of the problems of the USSR. But so is making Khrushchev a scapegoat for it, which many of these people are totally willing to do. All right, I'll end Badiou. Badiou appeared to be destined for a quiet career as an academic and writer, but because he became politically active in the 1960s, originally a member of the leftist party Socialist Unifé, the student worker protest of May, and by the way, it's been long commented that I can't pronounce anything French, so people pronounce that correct. The party Socialist Unifé, Unified, the Party of Unified Socialists. I don't know. I'm going to translate that in a second. The student worker protest of May 68 transformed Badiou into a Maoist revolutionary. He described the moment of political awakening as a religious conversion. Quote, I admit without any reticence that May 68 was for me, in the order of philosophy, as in everything else, a genuine road to Damascus experience. It is the masses who make history, and including the history of knowledge. Afterward, Badiou was active in the Maoist organization of the Union des Communistes de France, Marxist-Leninist, and the non-Maoist organization Politique. In addition, Badiou has combined his political activism with prodigious output of plays, philosophical works, literature, and political polemics. He is currently one of the most prominent intellectuals in France. Before explaining how Badiou views Mao, we must discuss his understanding of communism. According to Badiou, communism is a Platonic idea. This is almost like designed to piss off Domenico Losurdo, which is why there's an attempt to say that Badiou is not a Marxist-Leninist. He is. He's just the opposite kind from Losurdo. This is why I don't think political tendencies of self-profession are as meaningful as people say they are. I have found Trotskyists who believe the same thing as Marxist-Leninists, who think they're on the same side with other Marxist-Leninists, who actually believe the same thing as different Trotskyists, none of whom agree on each other in geopolitics or say what China or Russia should have done in the middle of the 20th century, or what should happen in the US now, or how you fight imperialism, although not all, see imperialism as a problem. Quote, every historical event is communist to the degree that communist designates transpersonal subjectivity of emancipation, the egalitarian passion, the idea of justice, the will to break with the compromises of the service des bin, the good service, the disposition of egoism, an intolerance of oppression, the wish to impose the withering away of the state. This almost sounds like my problems with David Graeber, which is like communism is the communal effects we had along the way. Anyway, for Badiou, communism itself is an idea that is not connected to any specific class, whether workers, serfs, peasants, or slaves. And instead, communism possesses an invariant and transhistorical character. Badiou takes invariance even way further than Bordiga. Quote, the communist invariants have no defined class character. They synthesize universal aspiration of the exploited to topple every principle of exploitation and oppression. That's a communist hypothesis. As much as I disagree with Chris Catrone on many things, his critique of Badiou, called the Marxist hypothesis, is pretty good. All right, go back here. Since all communist invariants emerge from similar political events, they take on shared characteristics. In the logic of the world, Badiou lists 4 common traits found in any political truth that aims at communism. Quote, all these truths articulate 4 determinations: will against socioeconomic necessity, equity against established hierarchies of power and wealth, confidence against anti-popular suspicion or fear of the masses, authority or terror against the natural free play of competition. This is a generic kernel of political truth of this type. The communist invariants not only share these 4 attributes, but they also are symbolized by proper names. Among these are highlighted are the Spartacus, Louis-Auguste Blanqui, Maximilien Robespierre, and Marx, Lenin, Guevara, and of course Mao. As Badiou says, for the unnamed masses who fight for emancipation, the proper names stand for the idea and truth of communism. Quote, the anonymous actions of millions of militants, rebels, fighters, unrepresentable as such, is combined and counted as one in a simple, powerful symbol of the proper name. Thus, proper names are involved in the operation of the idea, capitalized. And one I should just mention are the elements of the idea of communism at its various stages. While communism is an internal idea, Badiou, at least in his more Marxist days, argued that the proletariat was not doomed to simply go through the same past struggles repeatedly. Rather, the proletariat is a universal class through which the communist program can finally be realized. Quote, with the proletariat, the ideological resistance becomes not one of repetition of the invariant, but also the necessity of its realization. This is true because Marxism is the accumulation of knowledge from all past popular struggles carried out by all other communist invariants. Wow. This is why I call Badiou a Platonist Maoist and not a Marxist. But anyway, we'll come back here later. For the proletariat, Marxism now becomes a key instrument in the ultimate victory. We must conceive of Marxism as accumulated wisdom of the popular revolutions, the reasons they engender, and the fixation and precision of their target. When Badiou wrote these words in 1976, he undoubtedly saw Maoist thought as the highest synthesis of the Marxist knowledge for the proletariat. However, since the 1980s at least, Badiou has retreated from an identification of the proletariat as a universal class. A lot of people have retreated from that. Badiou sees communism as a political truth which undergoes periodic sequences of emergence, growth, and exhaustion. Quote, I will begin by saying that political truth can, after all, be described in a purely empirical way. It is concrete, time-specific sequence in which the new thought and a new practice of collective emancipation arise, exist, and eventually disappear. According to Badiou, there have been two separate sequences of modern communism. The first came with the French Revolution in 1792 and lasted until 1871. He argues that the major characteristics of the first sequence was combining mass movements of workers with the conquest of power. Quote, the sequence combined, under the sign of communism, the mass popular movement and a thematic seizure of power. The object was organized to organize popular movements in multiple forms, demonstrations, strikes, uprisings, armed actions, and so on, in preparation for the overturn, evidently meaning an insurrectional overturn such as by the name of revolution. This sequence ended with the Paris Commune, which Badiou identified as, quote, the supreme form of combination of the popular movements, working class leadership, and armed insurrection. I mean, it's interesting how geometric Badiou's thinking is, and that's another way of like he's a Platonist, in which he sees these as eternal forms of which we struggle to conceive to align ourselves with in specific evental and a Heideggerian sense, really, manifestations. If that seems arcane to you, well, it is, frankly. The second sequence lasted from the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 to the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976. That's convenient. Badiou argues that this sequence was dominated by the question of how to escape the defeat of the Paris Commune and achieve victory. I think that's kind of true. Lenin's Vanguard Party provided these answers. This obsession with victory and the real this is the real Al-Khan. I'm not going to get into that today. Was focused on the problems of organization and discipline and entirely contained from Lenin's What Is to Be Done of 1902 in theory and practice to the centralized and homogeneous class party. While the Vanguard Party allowed in the second sequence to take power, it created a new problem for the terroristic and bureaucratic party state. As Badiou put it, quote, the party, in fact, appropriate for insurrectionary and military victory over the weakened reactionary powers, proved ill-adapted for the construction of the state of the proletarian dictatorship in Marxist sense. Asterisk. Here, Badiou sounds like a council communist like Girder. But anyway. In other words, a state organizing the transition towards a non-state, a power of non-power, a dialectical form of the withering away of the state. The form of the party state, on the contrary, involved an experiment with an unprecedented form of authoritarianism, even a terroristic state, one that in any case was entirely separate from the people's practical life. Interesting. The main attempt to break out of the party state was an impasse was by Mao. Badiou argues that Mao was opposed to the depoliticization and ossification of the Stalinist state. Quote. Similarly, Mao rises up against Stalin's objectivism. He argues that Stalin only wants technology and cadres, and it only deals with knowledge of the laws. He neither indicates how to become master of these laws, nor does he sufficiently illuminate the subjective activism of the party and the masses. In truth, Mao indicts Stalin for variable depoliticization of the will. This depoliticization must be envisioned in terms of its most remote consequences to the transition to communism, the only source of legitimacy for the authority of the socialist state. Without a political break, without the will to abolish, quote, the old rules and the old systems, the transition to communism is illusory. For Mao, the way out of the Stalinist deadlock was the polarization of the masses and an assault on the party state. This took the form of the Cultural Revolution and the resurrection of the Paris Commune. Quote, we can therefore say without fear that, in the current phase of the revolutionary politics, the Cultural Revolution plays the role that the Paris Commune played in the Leninist sequence. Again, Badiou's level of math talk. The Cultural Revolution is a commune of the age of the Communist Party and social states. For Badiou, the Cultural Revolution was a historical attempt to break through the deadlock of the party state and renew the idea of communism. Yet Badiou identifies a contradiction in the Cultural Revolution between the need of order and rebellion. Quote, this is a Badiou quote. On one hand, the issue to arouse a mass revolutionary action in the margins of the state of the dictatorship of the proletariat are to acknowledge, in the theoretical jargon of the time, that even the state is formally a proletarian state, the class struggle continues, including the form of mass revolts. Mao and his followers will go so far as to say that under socialism, bourgeoisie reconstitutes itself and organizes itself within the Communist Party itself. And on the other hand, when an actual civil war is still being excluded, the general form of the relation of the party and the state, in particular concerning the use of repressive forces, This shows the way in which Badiou is not completely broken from Althusser. Must remain unchanged, at least insofar that it is not really a question of destroying the party. While Mao and his supporters told the masses that it is the right to rebel against the party state, they were also the need to maintain stability. Despite the Cultural Revolution's invocation of a new state based on the Paris Commune, Badiou notes that Mao wanted to maintain the party state, insisting that most cadres were basically good. For Badiou, the seizure of power, particularly the Shanghai People's Commune of 1967, revealed the failures of the self-imposed limits of the Cultural Revolution. This was my problem with Garrido's view of Western Marxism, is he talked about China without mentioning the conflicts of the Cultural Revolution in depth, and that they did not emerge from the West, nor that the Shanghai's Paris Communists in 1967 is not mentioned at all. In fact, the other players in the Sino-Soviet split, besides Khrushchev and the CPC, are not mentioned at all, such as the conflict between Ho Chi Minh and the Khmer Rouge, for example, of which both Losurdo and Garrido kind of just want to go away. All right. Mao ended up retreating to the commune form instead of supporting the creation of the 3-in-1 revolutionary committees composed of cadre from party, army, and mass organizations. This amounted to the restoration of the party state's power and authority. Furthermore, the workers' movement and the Red Guards were disbanded. Mao concludes that the Cultural Revolution proved that the party state cannot serve as a means to reach communism. Quote, the Cultural Revolution marks an irreplaceable experience of saturation because of a violent will to find new political path and to response to revolution, and to find new forms of the workers' struggle under the formal conditions of socialism ended up in failure when confronted with the necessary maintenance for reasons of public order and the refusal of civil war to the general frame of the party state. In terms of Mao himself, Badiou says he played a contradictory role in the Cultural Revolution as both rebel and restorationist. We can clearly see that Mao, by bringing in the workers, wanted to prevent the situation from turning into one of military control. He wanted to protect those who have been his initial allies and have been the bearers of enthusiasm and political innovation. But Mao is also a man of the party state. He wants its renovation, even a violent one, but not its destruction. In the end, he knows full well that by subjugating the last outpost of young rebellious leftists, he eliminates the last margin left to anything that is not the line in 1968, which recognized the leadership of the Cultural Revolution, the line of party reconstruction. He knows it, but he is resigned because he holds no alternative hypothesis. Nobody does, as to an extent that the state and the large majority of people, after 2 exhausted but trying years, wants the state to exist and to make the existence known, if necessary, with brute force. I do love how both these authors just like impose readings in people's minds without citing the sources for why they think that. But anyway. Ultimately, Badiou claims that the Cultural Revolution proves the next sequence of communism must dispense with the vanguard party. Well, we know today that all emancipatory progress must put an end to the model of the party, of multiple parties in order to form politics without a party, and yet at the same time without lapsing into a figure of anarchism, which has never been anything else than the vain critique of the double or the shadow of the communist parties, just like the black flag is only the double and shadow of the red flag. Yeah, except that Badiou goes further than many anarchists do. Right? Despite his denials, Badiou's communism is effectively a form of speculative anarchism, with its celebration of miraculous events. However, his concept of the invariant allows Badiou to avoid disillusionment like other former Maoists. Although in this, the concept of invariant you can only find in French and Italian Bourdigism and also Dementism. That's D-A-M-E-N-I-S-T. Or I-S-M. Anyway, you know what I mean if you're a left communist or a follow left communist like I do. Instead, he can argue for the revival of communism since it has always existed as a form of mass rebellion. Quote, I maintain the expression of the communist invariance against that of the death of communism, that at the very moment in which the monstrous avatar, literally disastrous, a state of communism is falling apart, it thus be a matter of the following. Any event which is foundational of truth exposes the subject, it induces to the eternity of the equal. See, geometric thought, fucking Platonism. Communism and having this eternity equally to serve a name, equally to serve, it's so hard to read. Communism and having named this eternity adequately serve to name a death. Ugh. Even now, Badiou refuses to disavow Mao. On the 50th anniversary of the Cultural Revolution in 2016, Badiou upheld Mao as a representative of the communist idea. Quote, you might say that I first saw Mao in the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, because that's the way it used to be known, until people got really concerned that it was confusable with the CCCP and wanted to really distinguish it from the USSR. Interestingly, that is considered somehow a disparagement. Anyway, was a left critique of the Soviet politics. Mao's major grievance was as follows. Stalin's vision isn't dialectical. He represented the congealed, immobilized state socialism, whereas Mao, as it is clear in all his great texts, thinks in an almost infinite way. In the end, Badiou holds true to his youthful Red Guard beliefs by affirming Mao as the eternal rebel. Two halves don't make a whole. What would Losurdo and Badiou say to each other's views on Mao? Losurdo would likely consider Badiou to be infected with Western Marxist abstractions and anarchism in a celebration of mass rebellion and disregard for the needs of realism. Quote, this is Barn inserting. Garrido explicitly says that about Badiou, and also misidentifies Badiou and just calls him an anarchist to court without dealing with any of his history. Unquote. That's me. By contrast, Badiou would no doubt consider Losurdo to be a Stalinist cop with his defense of order, normalcy, and the bureaucracy party state. Between them, no resolution could be possible, yet this contradiction does not add up to a coherent picture of Mao. In Mao, there is an antinomy without resolution between the opposed dialectic of the Dengist and the Red Guard. The source of this irresolvable conflict is built into Mao's dialectic since he rejects any reconciliation or negation of negation. Yep, that part of dialectics is not in what Mao's unity of opposites. Mao's unity of opposites is more akin to Taoism. Now, he was explaining this to Chinese peasants, which has been always my defense of that language, but it is a problem. Instead, there is an eternal struggle between opposites. According to Mao, there is always rival positions in politics representing different roads, such as the bourgeois or the proletarian, the capitalist or the socialist, the Dengist and the Red Guard. Depending on the requirement of the situation at hand, Mao himself oscillates between the opposed positions. This ambiguity was most clearly on display during the Cultural Revolution, when Mao was a source of both the ultimate authority and rebellion. In religious terms, it could be said that Mao was both God and Lucifer. Ultimately, the Dengist and the Red Guard fail to understand Mao, since neither are willing to conclude an identity between their unity of opposites. My critique of this essay is that it's good at breaking down both the problems and positions of Losurdo and Badiou, but you're going to have to do more than just pointing out the problems of not dealing with the negation of negation dialectically in Mao to really make this argument. You got to go into the history more in detail than any of these people did. Then you can make that point as a point in historical movement, which means this needs to be a book. And it's unfair to critique an article for not being a book, but also you should know the scope of the article in which you're writing. Doug does a good job here, though, in laying out the essential tension of Maoism and why Maoism played both as a critique of Marxist-Leninism and as a manifestation in defense of it. Mao Spondex, MIM, all these different forms of Maoism are often critiques of Soviet orthodoxy, not just of Khrushchevian orthodoxy, but also Stalin's orthodoxy too, while defending the figure of Stalin, so that Stalin isn't cast out as a scapegoat for the entire failure of the Soviet Union. Now, I'm not particularly a defender of Mr. Mustache Man, but I will say that people who demonize Stalin as the primary cause of the problems of the Soviet Union do not understand the history in play. And I would tell them to read Eric von Wrie's work, Political Thought of Joseph Stalin, to understand why. But Wrie points out that often Stalin is picking up on ambiguities in Lenin, where Lenin is wrestling with things in Marx and Engels, and sometimes contradicting Marx and Engels, and sometimes siding with them. And that Van Wrie actually points out in debates, for example, on the national socialism in one country in the 1920s, that you could easily attribute Kamenev's, Zinoviev's, Trotsky, Stalin, and Bukharin's position all to Lenin in different time periods. And he textually proves it. So I would tell people to read those texts, read the work of Eric Van Ree, and sit with them before making it off of one scholar. And if you ever judge an entire historical period off of one scholar that confirms something you want to believe, you are an unserious thinker. That is all. Keep your peace. Good day. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. There's more on the Patreon. I mentioned in the beginning. Have a great day.